Hello there, this is Kate Mackenzie and welcome to my podcast. Today I'm interviewing the fabulous Peter York, or Peter Wallace as he's known by both names, who you may know from his prolific output of books and columns, GQ, Management Today, FT, Sloane Ranger's Handbook, Cooler, Faster, More Expensive, The Return of the Sloane Ranger, his recent book, The War Against the BBC, How an Unprecedented Combination of Hostile Forces is Destroying Britain's Greatest Cultural Institution and Why You Should Care. Also, his other books and his play, How to Be a Nicer Person, his comments on his social awareness and style and branding and marketing, and how he loved his life, how it's been a creative life, not a careerist life, and how he's engaged in so many things, and how many things, once you get to a certain place, come to you. And yet, when he stood up for the BBC, which he feels is being rather bullied at the moment, how people didn't want to know. And this was a very different place for him that he was surprised by, that, you know, when you stand for something that seems to be being pushed underground, how, you know, many people will not stand by you because they get frightened. But in some ways, he's been in a position to stand up for the BBC and to stand up for why it's so important. So this was a really lovely, interesting talk. I really appreciate him giving me the time and the space to do this. And it's a really fascinating insight into someone's life who has been able to explore and listen, discuss and interview all kinds of people from all kinds of situations and lives, and then write about it. So I hope you enjoy this. I certainly did. Thanks very much. Hello, Peter.
Oh.
Hello, Peter. What a joy to see you and to celebrate all the things that you are and have done. Honestly, when I looked you up, I got slightly overwhelmed. There were so many books, columns, TV shows, contributions, you know, from working with David Putnam on children's education to, you know, SRU to branding.
Isn't it? I can't remember. Of course, I have no idea what it was, but there is a lot of it. Whatever it is, there's a lot of it.
It was incredible.
So I
say that again.
It's quite various.
It was wonderful. It was wonderful. And so what I wondered was, we're going to explore all your things, including the anniversary of Sloane Ranger's Handbook this year, and also your book on saving the BBC. But what I wanted to ask you, if this is okay, is what brought you to be the social commentator, as they call you, style guru, or, you know, brand maestro? What brought you from your upbringing? What were you always observing things? What was it about you and your parents and how you were brought up that kind of led you to being the person you are right now?
I don't know the answer, but I can have a go at it.
Yeah.
And actually, possibly the most important thing that focused all these things was my first proper job, my first and only employer, because my first proper job, my first and only employer, was in market research, at the clever end of market research, the ultra pretentious end of market research, in Lower Belgrave Street, next door to Lord Lucan.
Oh.
So this was not this was market research done the pretentious way in a very smart bit of London. And I mean, the serious thing about that is that we were in the business of helping people sell things and ideas or whatever by putting together very accurate pictures of groups of people. So you had to do a lot of observing and be very conscious of the things that really mattered in distinguishing people from each other. So you were on the lookout for differences and identifying marks and things that people typically said or never said, or things that ideas that they liked or they said they liked, and all that stuff. So you were listening out and you were watching out and all that stuff. And what had predisposed me to this, I'm trying to think.
I remember you saying your mum took you to enormous amounts of different things, which
yes.
maybe weren't up your street, but you went and explored all kinds of different things with your mum.
I mean, one, I went to a progressive school, and the funny thing, I was trying to explain this to a clever sociologist I know who was doing a thing about influencers before they were called influencers.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things about progressive schools, is that they, if you think back about them, if you think back, you were sort of 20 years ahead of whenever it was, or then, because progressive schools were then raising people in the assumptions of all sorts of social attitudes and behavior and stuff that was then not conventional, broadly liberal social attitudes and liberal assumptions, all this stuff, that now looks modern for its time. That's one. And so I think that I was sort of living in a different world than my home county's medium grade public school cousins, who were still living in an almost pre-war world.
That makes so much sense. And you went to King Alfred's. Who chose that for you?
My parents chose it for me, and they were having a funny turn. I think had they been looking later, they wouldn't have. They had a funny turn, and I'm very glad they did.
So you went to a school where you could choose whether you attended classes, or you could choose what you did, and that I suppose
it wasn't. We were always jealous of people who went to schools, progressive schools, that were allegedly more progressive. So you could do more choosing, and the idea was that in those progressive schools, children were smoking dope at the age of 2, or we didn't know. But there were always things in popular papers about progressive schools and about the outrageousness of them. They weren't outrageous at all. We were we did modern things like having a school council, a sort of school parliament, and talking to what other people would have called their masters and mistresses by their Christian names. And up to a certain point, you were allowed to choose your subjects. So up to O level, you were allowed to choose your subjects. And I remember giving up Latin in favor of woodwork, which is probably not a brilliant idea, but I was allowed to do it, so I did.
That makes a lot of sense, because it sounds like it developed equality, listening, and being interested in everyone. It was
when you think about it, and people would say, well, it's this and that and the other, and it's a very very inclusive, and people didn't say inclusive, but that's what they meant, all those things, school. And even then, I remember thinking, oh, come off it. It is private. You're having to pay for this. So there's a bit of hypocritical posturing there, although people, I think they meant well. I think the parents meant well, the staff meant well, the idea was good. And the idea came from the new education of literally the 1890s. And it'd been set up by people who had come from Bedales. So it was sort of Bedales in London.
That's interesting. So your left-wing leanings were already there as you were looking at private education.
I don't know about my left-wing leanings. I don't think I had a real political thought in my head, but it did occur to me that private education wasn't necessarily a fantastically left-wing thing to do.
Yeah. So the other thing I wanted to ask you about, I know you went to work for Conrad Jameson, and I know somehow he was this marvelous guru for you at the time, and somehow your mum knew him. How did your mum know him?
I'm trying to remember how that connection was made, but it was, and I'm just not 100% sure, but some magic thing had me there doing stuff and sort of thinking, oh, I want to do this forever, and I hope he'll employ me, and he did.
And you also have, I've heard you say, you were luckily uneducated, and I wondered, what did you mean by that? Did you get encouraged to go to university, or did you get discouraged?
Well, I think, I'm looking at that from the point of view of the 21st century, when an enormous percentage of middle-class children go to university or some kind of some sort of serious further education. And the fact was that wasn't always the case. It only tipped over into being the case in, I think, well into the 80s, that thing. I mean, now, sort of nearly, I think I've got this right, nearly 50% of the whole nation gets university-like educated. And, once upon a time, it was something like 8%. So the absolute assumption that everybody would go to a university and get a degree was important, but not overwhelming them. There were all sorts of other things that people did.
So what do you feel was lucky that you didn't get educated?
Well, I mean, when I say lucky, I mean, I was lucky not just in not going into a thing that, into an institution that funneled you towards a particular kind of career or thing, as opposed to what people now call lifetime learning. Also, that it meant I ended up in this commercial space where you learnt an enormous amount as you went about the way the world worked. So, it's not, I mean, I think for the most part, I wouldn't discourage people from going to university, is what I mean. But it sort of worked out for me. And it wasn't for want of trying, I have to say. So, and it's something to do also with the thing of progressive schools, which are the opposite of schools suitable for tiger mothers. That whole idea, particularly Chinese and Asian tiger mothers who absolutely make their kids work like that towards an end, and the end is getting the fantastic set of qualifications that leads inexorably to a fantastic job that is very, very, very well paid. And it was the absolute opposite of that. In that sense, it was pretty hopeless, which meant that the people who went to universities, and good universities, were not only clever, not only hardworking, but pretty focused quite early on. And I can think exactly of the good boys and girls that I knew at school who did end up in Oxbridge, but they weren't being pushed absolutely towards it, and they didn't have tiger parents. That's the difference. It came out of their own application, because nobody made you apply. So I can tell you that at A level, I was very bored by, say, the set books. I was very bored by the set books. I didn't read them. Nowhere else could this possibly happen. Nowhere else would you be allowed to. And I can remember that, for instance, doing French A level, the reading was really boring, whereas French O-level had been exciting because it had been all the sexy 19th century things. Whereas at A-level, which is absolutely idiotic, it reversed, and you had classical 17th century plays, but I didn't read.
This makes so much sense. So I know from...
So there's, and at O-level, if you were tolerably clever and did a bit of the reading, you could pass rather well. But come A-level, it really was, you really did need to apply yourself. And at very least, you need to have read the set books. And I didn't.
So that makes so much sense, that what you're saying is, because I know that, you know, in the 70s and the 80s, you really worked so hard and you focused always, you enjoy work.
Well, once you came across something that you really liked, once you were working with people who you rather hero worshipped, and you thought, oh, I could be like that. Your application set in, so you wanted to learn stuff, and you enjoyed what you were doing.
So I know
so
that
you've got application and motivation.
So that makes sense why you're so prolific and you've engaged in so much, and you still do, and you've been, you know, labeled an influencer and labeled one of the power people. And yet I wanted to ask you, when you wrote the Sloane Ranger, which was obviously a total hit, and it's coming out again this year, and you're going to celebrate it this year. So Tom Wolfe was obviously doing that in America. So was that a huge influence on you, American
Yes.
culture? And how did that influence you?
Immensely. Tom Wolfe was a huge influence. And I was reading Tom Wolfe before I'd ever been to America. And he was fascinated by all the things that I was fascinated by. And even the things I didn't know about, he made me fascinated by them. So all those figures, all those trends, all those, and the way he wrote, lots of English people copied it for effect. I didn't really, but I took it on board. It enabled me to loosen up a bit. But be slightly less English. Loosen up.
And did that help you develop? Obviously, going to progressive school gave you an outsider's view on society in some ways, because you weren't an insider in the kind of more straight conforming schools at the time. But did looking at Tom Wolfe give you a chance to analyze, like, for example, Sloane's or Dictator's showrooms, or, you know, did it give you this, where did you get this outsider ability to look inside at
well, it's a combination of all those things. It's a combination of going to that funny sort of school, my own interest in reading habits, getting that funny sort of job, because market research then wasn't as developed, wasn't as much of an assumption about everybody's life. That, you know, have we done some market research? Lots of institutions never did any market research. Now everybody does some. But then it was a new perspective on the world. Let's it's the most basic thing. Let's go to the people, let's go to the audience for this, let's go to the market for this and talk to those people. Let's find out what they do and how they feel. So, and particularly how they feel, how they look at things. That was the most important single thing.
So you were at the beginning of a movement, really, which was to actually find out what real people thought about the actual things that people wanted to sell to people.
I wasn't a pioneer. I was part of a group of people who were the beneficiaries of that. People had done the pioneering, people who'd set up businesses, and then the generation which worked in those businesses and had the disciplines and the luck to be able to be paid to do stuff that I would have done for free.
Because you enjoyed it.
Yeah,
you enjoyed it.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
enjoyed going to different sitting rooms across the UK and finding
Yes.
out what people
Yes.
actually felt about things.
Yes, and across the world.
And across the world.
Yes.
Yeah.
I
And
went to all sorts of places, in some of which I couldn't speak the languages, obviously, but there were always instant translation on hand.
Wow. So, you know, as you speak, it just sounds like it's been a passion, you know, a creative passion.
It was. And it taught you a lot about the world and taught you not only to look at things, you know, as a deep dive middle-class Londoner, going out and going to all those northern towns you wouldn't have gone to otherwise, not really, to the towns. And I went to all the big towns in the UK, and it was fascinating. And we can remember the cadences. So when I first started and went to big towns in Yorkshire, people spoke in a particular way they don't quite now. They spoke what I call Alan Bennett speak. And that was fascinating, actually, to hear people sitting around you talking Alan Bennett speak or Victoria Wood speak.
So getting familiar with different accents was new for you?
Getting familiar with the whole world of provincial Britain, big city and medium-sized town and suburban provincial Britain was wonderful.
What?
And Scotland,
yeah.
Just going to Scotland at all.
You love Scotland. You love Scotland.
I loved going there. It was very exciting.
And so just tell me a little bit more, because obviously you've done so many books, writing and columns, writing about punk, writing about Sloane Rangers, writing and doing programs on hipsters and also Sloane's again, the cooler, faster, more expensive, as well as dictators. So mixing, looking at fashion, looking at style, looking at branding, looking at social mores, and also authenticity being a con. What? Tell me about that. What is authenticity being a con?
Well, I've always had my ear out for people having a particular rap about things which weren't really right, you know, and words that came to irritate me. And authenticity was one of those words that came enormously to irritate me, because authenticity is a way of talking about things and talking them up in a very vague way, where you can cast it whatever way you like, saying somebody's very authentic. What does that mean? What does it mean? They mean somehow that they might say it's a posh way of saying real, or a way of saying a bit rough, a bit of a rough diamond, or what, there are all sorts of implications in that, which are vague, patronizing, and inauthentic. So I just felt I had to write a book about it. And interesting enough, I'm not the only one. It's a cult, or it's a way of talking about the world, which is very indirect and very deceptive, and it's often used in advertising. The idea of authenticity in advertising. It's also making a claim. The speaker, when they talk about authentic, they're making a claim for themselves of superior understanding. What they're saying is, I can detect whether this is the real thing. I am the arbiter of real thingness. In areas where the whole thing's completely up for grabs, really, that there isn't, a true or false, that's worth establishing. Did this happen? did that person do that thing on that date? That's determinable and worth knowing, true or false. But somebody saying in a great wafty, lofty way that something's authentic is just annoying.
And that's different to saying this is a Louis XIV chair. That's different.
No, that is different. The word there is real.
Yeah.
It was made in the realm of Louis XIV.
Yeah. You're talking about bandying around a word. You're talking about
it's a sort of a very, very vague endorsement where the speaker is taking a lot of imaginary power onto themselves.
Got it.
And it's a way of adding value, as advertising people say. It's adding value. This, now, sample this, my dear. This is the authentic cheese of Tunbridge Wells, only made in a little tiny corner of Tunbridge Wells when the sun is down. You know that once people talk about authentic, a lot of tosh follows.
Got it.
Tosh, marketing speak talk, will follow.
Got it. And I know you did a play, which I saw, How to Be a Nicer Type of Person. And how
it was really a rant rather than a play.
Yeah. How do you be a nicer type of person?
Well, I can't remember what I advised. Wear nicer clothes, I think I said.
I know there were a lot of ties.
Rails of clothes. I did it in Edinburgh and I did it at Soho Theatre.
Yeah.
And a lot of rails of clothes, and pointed out the sort of thing that obviously I couldn't do it for women.
Yeah.
That would be quite wrong. But I did it for guys. Don't wear that, whatever you do.
Yes, because I remember you talking about branding and how important it is that you don't look mad, and that you look.
Best not to look mad.
And
yes.
you look what you're saying. You know, you match up, so you're not confusing people with what you're saying.
Yes. Well, I mean, I was giving people a sort of very obvious bit of advice. I mean, of course, there's a role for people who look mad, providing the act they were doing was, quotes, mad, like Arthur Brown and his corona of flames.
Yeah.
Nobody will remember that.
Yeah.
There used to be a pop singer called Arthur Brown.
Oh, no.
A sort of brazier on his head.
That's right. He's still around. He married some friends of mine.
There you go.
There you go. He's still around. So I'm sure some people can look him up. Yeah, very famous. So, but it was so interesting because you've talked about how the influx of female Labour MPs were put together, were styled, because we were in this new era in the 80s, 90s.
Barbara
that was 90s. Follettism.
Barbara, they were folletted.
Folletted.
They were made, smartened up by Barbara Follett, the wife of the novelist, the popular novelist Ken Follett, and in their pomp. Now, here is a fascinating thing. They lived in the wonderful house on Cheney Row in Chelsea that my first employer had lived in.
It all joins up.
It's now lived in by a very rich American banker.
So what do you feel now? Now we're, I know you've been doing a book, The War Against the BBC, and you've made a wonderful case about how important the BBC is with just one example, music, for example, but also the amount of television shows that are sold around the world and how it brings in income to the UK, and how different people at different times have been, from Gordon Brown to other MPs have been reducing, and with decisions like over 75s don't have to pay a fee. So all these different things that are kind of reducing what the BBC is able to do, and you've been arguing it should be looked after, which makes a lot of sense. But what is it about the BBC? You know, is that because of you growing up with? Because as you know, we're in a different era where, I mean, many young people do not watch television at all. So
yes, I mean, I think the whole thing about what young people are said to do is overplayed. The fact is, the important value of the BBC is as a public service. And its role as a public service is to create social cohesion, pull us together, make us better educated, better informed, and better entertained, with better entertainment as well. And the idea is it's universal. So there's something for everyone. And when people make comparisons with Netflix, they're either dishonest because there is no comparison to be made with Netflix. It's a completely ridiculous comparison. Netflix is wonderful in its way, but it doesn't do what the BBC does. It's not trying to do what the BBC does. It's a global profit-driven organization, rather like a 21st century version of Blockbuster or Iceland. You know, Iceland, it's all in the freezer. So basically what Netflix does is have a lot of stuff with a long life. It has to be long life stuff. It's overwhelmingly entertainment ready there. And the more countries you can sell it in, the better. So the one big British thing is, of course, the Crown. And it's the one British institution which people think they know right across the world. They're not going to do a series about mill workers in Lancashire. They're not going to do any of those things. They're not. They only can take stuff British originated when it's got a world market. And on the other hand, there's no point or money in doing Gardener's Question Time or Radio Stoke-on-Trent or any kind of question time. That's not what they're for. We need all that. And people who say we don't need all that are lying, because there is a group of bad people, dishonest people, who want the BBC out of the picture. They want it out of the picture first because they actually ideologically dislike public service in it. In the same way, those people who behind the scenes want to make to privatize bits of the NHS. It's not a good look at the moment, so they're not so eager to say it. They've got no inhibition about saying the BBC should take ads or be subscription. Actually, that makes no sense in any way at all. It's not good economics. It's not good for the nation. What the BBC should be is a universal service. And I have to tell you, it's perfectly possible. You know, there isn't something about Netflix which means that anything which was there before has to go away. It's at that Netflix is a technology and a business model. It's not the voice of the future.
No, that makes so much sense.
But if you are the BBC's enemies, you say, oh, the BBC, lovely in its time, but of course, in the age of Netflix, nobody needs it. In the age of Netflix, it's never been needed before. And to prove that, I would give you two things, and they're related. The January 6th Washington riots and Fox News. The American fragmented, crazy, polarized media situation makes for a fragmented, crazy, polarized nation which is becoming ungovernable.
And so what do you feel about, for example, Laura Kuenssberg, who's, and this idea of client journalism, the idea that even BBC journalists are speaking for politicians, this type of thing?
Well, when you say client journalism, look, I think Laura Kuenssberg is very good at some things and has a very good way of summarizing a certain sort of Westminster political situations. The problem for me is that she sees politics in terms of what happens in Westminster. And there's a lot more to politics than that, and a lot more behind politics than that, and a great many trends which make people and parties relevant and resonant, that if your stuff is all about who's in, who's out in Westminster, you miss out on them completely. And so that would apply to most major political editors, major political mainstream media commentators. They think that politics is simply and only about the game. And that means that their access to top politicians is their biggest asset. And that makes them inherently small c conservative about what they say, because they don't want to piss off the big politicians that they have access to. So that makes for a circular thing that's terribly irritating. If in your real world, none of this stuff about who's up and who's down in the 1922 committee and whether you can get that vote and who is the rising star in the Treasury and. I mean, I'm sort of fascinated by it because I've got a certain amount of proximity to some of those people. But I know from all my experience, and particularly from my market research experience, that it's utterly uninteresting to lots of people and utterly irrelevant to lots of people. And I just think politics is a bigger subject.
That's a very good point, because one of the things, obviously, you made a brilliant argument for why the BBC is so important, and it makes so much sense. But quite a lot, there's been one-upmanship in the BBC. There's been a boys' club where you had to know people in the past to get in. There's been, people like Jimmy Savile and tolerance of all kinds of stuff, which you've named in your book. And also how the BBC has been controlled by government in charge, and quite complex issues with the BBC. And equally, David Dimbleby making jokes about people living in other counties other than around London. Do you know? So
no, I don't. What are these jokes? Well, I think David Dimbleby.
Yeah, well, maybe I'm not quoting the right person, but quite often, when there's voting, voting times, quite often there's been London-centric sort of jokes around.
Yes. Oh God, yes.
Around.
Well, people should get out. They should get. But it's not just the BBC. We have been for more than a century a London-centric nation. London is overwhelmingly the biggest city. Not like Germany, where there are a number of big-ish cities. London is overwhelmingly the biggest city. London is a world city in terms of size and everything else, while the rest of our cities are nowhere near. So you can't blame that on the BBC. And the BBC, unlike, let us say, the Daily this or the Daily that, has 50% and rising of its employees outside London. And it has Radio Stoke-on-Trent. I'm not sure it's got Radio Tunbridge Wells. I love talking about Tunbridge Wells, but it's got all those things and that stuff. It does all sorts of quite granular stuff. And for that matter, as far as I know, it was Jimmy Savile who actually did those bad things, not the chairman and board of director general and the board of the BBC. they were not as sharp about it as they should have been. But you realize that not only did Jimmy Savile do that stuff at and around the BBC, he did it in mental hospitals and hospitals and and morgues and all sorts of places. Those people, so a lot in the context of the education system, a lot in the context of the NHS, people don't apply the Jimmy Savile odium to those institutions because they're not bothered to. They want to get the BBC and say that the BBC, one of the things about right-wing propaganda is they're always talking about pedos. They're obsessed with paedophilia. So Jimmy Savile is a perfect stick to beat the BBC with. But if you were a really nasty person, it would have been a perfect stick to beat lots of the NHS, lots of the education system, the mental institutions, all that stuff, because he did that everywhere. And for that matter, in his time, both Thatcher and the royal family took up Jimmy Savile because they thought that he was the voice of the modern world, that he was the voice of youth, and that he could help them put their messages across and translate themselves. So, slightly idiotic, I think, but they certainly did. You'll find, he stayed at Chequers.
Oh, many, many times.
Yes.
And she forced through his knighthood.
Yes, absolutely. Even though there was already a bit of advice against it.
Yeah, even though people were complaining about it. And I did ask a journalist, how come no one did anything about him? And this journalist said too much connection to too much power. And he was protected.
He was very protected. And look, that was somebody who was a real hardened tough, hardened by running tough clubs in the rough end of Leeds back at the turn of the 50s stroke 60s, and very capable of threatening people.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So, Peter, just to ask you, how do people, I know that you've been involved in so many things, including, promoting all kinds of things. Like I heard you recently talk about how important unions are, especially in this time when you and NHS people are not paid well. But I just wondered, because when you write something like the Sloane Ranger's Handbook, I know often people who consider themselves Sloanes consider you the godfather of Sloanedom, which I wondered how does this work in with your different hats on? How do people see you politically or in a media way when you've got these different worlds?
Well, because these worlds aren't completely, they don't always overlap for those people. People see you according to the particular lens they say that they experience and what they've seen you through. So there's definitely a sort of a Sloane world with its assumptions, and then there's a very urban world of fashion land and music land of a certain period, because I've been in there and written about those things, and those are the things that they concentrate on. So, and for that matter, there's a world of British business and British culture that I've had things to say about, and they don't absolutely, there are people, I do know people who join up those things, but mostly they don't. So they see one slice.
So how is that for you? Because I'd imagine that people might not realize your political leanings either. They might make assumptions about all kinds of parts of you. How is that for you? Do you just go along with the different assumptions, or and you've got two different names as well that you work with for working and for media. And so how is that?
It's fine by me, but it may be confusing for others. I'm perfectly happy with it. And, I don't think of myself as a conventionally highly political person. And I think a lot of my time, I've had intermittent phases of being interested in things which were explicitly political, but not being a Westminster. Until quite recently, I wasn't at all a Westminster follower in the Coonsbergy sense. Nobody would invite me to be a political editor, and I didn't want to be. So most of the time, I've been a happy modish airhead. I've got a very strong modish airhead side to me.
And I remember you saying that, because I asked you once, you had a review on something you were doing in the Evening Standard that was really, really awful. And I asked you, how do you manage these things? And you said, a third will like you, a third will hate you. Got to like yourself.
Yes. Oh, well, I don't remember what that standard, and now I'm sort of thinking, what was that review?
Well,
Who wrote this thing?
I'm sure it was fine.
Let me out and at them.
Yeah.
I can't remember what it was.
I'm sure it was mild. I'm sure it was mild.
I can't remember it.
Yeah. But
if people said, oh, he's a modish airhead, they were usually right. And that I know that there was a time that I, in sort of politicized in their different ways, things like the NME or the Guardian regarded me as the enemy. And I kept on thinking, why do we? It's perfectly obvious now, but it was the idea of what they thought I was about. And they might have been right.
That's the thing, yeah. Moving across these worlds, maybe the other thing I wanted to ask you knew Quentin Crisp.
Yes.
How was that?
That was completely wonderful. And I'm trying to remember how it came. I do remember how it came about. My very first day at Harpers Queen, the magazine, which did it for me. It was completely marvelous. I hadn't written a word of journalism before then. And Harpers Queen, and in particular Ann Barr, so to speak, took me up and let me write what I wanted, whether the readers wanted it or not. The first day I was there, I met somebody I know to this day, a sort of writer, part-time artist, gossiper, called Andrew Barrow. And Andrew said, I'm going to take you to meet somebody you will really enjoy. And that was Quentin Crisp in his famous room in
Beaufort Street.
Beaufort Street, exactly, in Beaufort Street, the room where famously, if you don't dust, the dust gets no worse after 2 years, all those things. And it was riveting. And I did get to know him and write about him and go to his various performances and introduce him to my friends and interview him for the telly in America once he'd gone to America and all that stuff. And it's one of those bits of luck, wealth, what I call real wealth, is knowing people not for what they can do for you, but for how they can open your head up.
Yeah.
And that's the greatest possible privilege. So it's marvelous to have known Quentin Crisp.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. And the other bit which I always found interesting was talking to you about how, you wanted to be a journalist, but you didn't know how to do that. And you had this thing, if I'm quoting you right, so you have to correct me if I'm not, that you had this thing called willing, which is to imagine something you wanted. And so you wanted to be a journalist, but you wanted someone to guide you. you got Ann Barr. And then I
Yes.
talked to you once and you said, you quite fancied, for example, a column in the FT. And you thought, I know, I'm going to this kind of media games night. There might be a person from the FT at that games night. I know, maybe I could chat to them. And you went thinking about your media column in the FT, and you went to this games night in Hammersmith, and a person answered the door and said, oh, may I take you for lunch? And it was the very person that you'd wanted to chat to, and you'd been thinking about it. Now,
Yes.
do you think like that?
I mean, that's a bit of what they say, that your luck gets better the harder you work at it.
Right.
And it makes me sound more careerist than I think of myself as being, but maybe it's true. Anyway, it's very, very, very lucky.
Yeah, but I suppose the bit which I was so interested in was that you having fun with the creativity of, oh, I'd love to be a journalist, no idea how to do it. So let me imagine someone's going to help me do it. And then you've got that. And it's just these amazing sort of, I'd like to do radio shows, I'd like to do TV shows, I'd like to do, and somehow all these things coming together.
After a time, it all comes together because people come after you, which is lovely. People come and search you out, even if you're an absolute shy water. But in the first instance, on the journalistic front, it was meeting Ann Barr and me saying to her, I can do this. I can do this. And there was nothing to say I could because I'd never done it before. But she let me do it.
How did you meet Ann Barr? How did you meet Ann Barr?
I can tell you absolutely. My then girlfriend was doing film reviews. And we went to, and most of the time you went to little cinemas in Soho and watched with all the other critics and reviewers and so on. And every so often, I went with her, and it was a treat. I'd watch anything. It was just lovely to go from where I was to a Soho cinema and watch a new film before it was released. I didn't care whether it was good or bad. It was just thrilling to go to the pictures. And every so often, you got invited to a bigger thing, a premiere, a thing at a film studio, something like that. And we went to something like that, and we met Ann Barr. That was wonderful.
Sounds very exciting. And Peter, you sound like everything comes to you now, like there's a flow and you can just relax. You can still follow your creative impulses, but things come to you. You're able to be someone approached.
Well, I can tell you something very fascinating, that in relation to the book about the BBC, things didn't come to you because what we, my co-writer, Prof. Patrick Barwise, and I were saying was stuff that a lot of people didn't want to hear. So actually, it didn't. I'm quite used to people coming to me for comments and stuff about books and talking it up, and I feel I know how to do that. But the underlying political thing. Now, thing one, the national newspapers. 80% of the national newspapers, 80% of print sales, which is a good way of talking about it, are national newspapers owned or directed by tax exile right-wing billionaires. The reality, I mean, the even vaguely sort of centre-lefty bit of national newspapers now only about 20%. So just think about what that means and who that means. You know a bit about the Mail, for instance, or the Express, or it's very, very fascinating. Now, for all the familiar reasons the national news, though that 80% of the national newspapers does not want to make the case for the BBC, rather the opposite. They do several articles a week saying the BBC is awful, the BBC is a lot of Marxist, the BBC is terribly extravagant, the BBC is very, very woke. They're onward and onward and onward. So the normal stuff, if you write a tolerably interesting book and if you can talk tolerably well about it, you get invited to contribute things, or people write nice big articles about the theme of your book. Blackout. Nothing in those, in the things. Then, in terms of news and major political discussions, the BBC is at the core of everything. As Carol Cadwallader, marvellous Carol Cadwallader says, if it's not on the BBC, it hasn't really happened. Now, but for a variety of reasons, you know, not talking about yourself too much, navel gazing, fear of this government, all sorts of reasons, the BBC has done nothing about it, or until very, very recently, when there was the big bang out with Nadine Dorries. For a year after the book came out, they didn't do anything.
Wow.
So, I mean, that's astonishing.
Wow.
Equally, nor did Channel 4, because Channel 4 lives in terror of being privatized. So Channel 4 actually was rather timid about talking about its own future. So you can see there's quite a lot of blanking out going on there.
So in some ways, this
is a new experience for me. I'm not used to being blacked out.
You've stepped out of line, and you're feeling the cold hand.
Yeah, the cold hand for sure. Look, I can look after myself a little bit, but it's been a great illustration of how you can be blacked out. And the fascinating thing is the BBC, terrified of being seen as paddling, making its own case. Absolutely, quite literally. We haven't, until literally the last couple of weeks, we haven't done anything. I understand, I think they're wrong. I sort of understand the thinking that goes behind. And they've been in a situation where they've been bullied and pressured by this government and its friends every hour of every day.
So in some ways...
Very unpatriotic, I would say, bullying the BBC.
Yeah, so in some ways, you're actually fighting and championing something that's been bullied and pushed away and that can't speak up for itself. You and Patrick are actually... And
it is very interesting. There are lots of completely mad things about the BBC, and lots of things about the BBC which aren't remotely as people imagine, and certainly aren't remotely like its enemies describe. It is not a bubbling pot of Marxism, that's for sure. I mean, it couldn't be more careful, centre edging towards centre right in its senior management, its board, and all those things. They're very, very careful indeed. And do you know, when people say, oh, it's terribly woke, just try Netflix for wokeness. Netflix wouldn't film in Georgia because of their attitudes to abortion and so on. They're fantastically woke and very Californian, much woker than the BBC. Most people now in mainstream media are mainstream broadcast media are pretty woke in terms of those attitudes. But they try to find, there are people employed to find examples of wokeness.
So in some ways, you're stepping out of line, although you said something shifted in the last 2 weeks, but in some ways, you've been kind of actually, from having a very wonderfully floating life, you've now standing up.
Well, look, forget about the current establishment of the BBC or anything else. The BBC is an important and valuable organisation for Britain in every way. And without it, we'd be a considerably more vulnerable country, vulnerable to the madness of crowds.
Well, thank you so much, Peter. What a gorgeous chat. What a gorgeous thing you've done. And look at you looking after the nation with the BBC. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Wow, it's so gorgeous. And good luck with all the books this year, and the BBC book and the Sloane Rangers book. So
thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care. Bless you. So that was Peter York. Such an interesting, generous, good soul with so much to say about so many things. And we just touched into a few things. But of course, somebody who's really taken the time to study, to read, to create books, articles, plays, TV shows, so many things, to give us insights into our society, perhaps particularly UK society, and what that's like. But also someone who's spent time all around the UK and around the world getting to know what real people feel about real stuff through his career in market research. So he's really someone who wishes to build opinion based on what is really going on for people. And that always makes someone so interesting, because they are, in a way, verifying what they're saying or what they're expressing. And yet also at this point in his life, he's been able to stand up for the BBC, who he's experiencing as being bullied. So he's kind of, in a way, come into his own, come into his power. In a way, he's an influencer and a person who people come to. And he can now be in a position to stand up for an organisation that he believes in, that he feels is perhaps not being treated well, not being treated right, and may not have the power to stand up for itself. So what an interesting man, what an interesting time, and what an interesting life. You know, he's coming out, standing up for the BBC, and maybe others will, and maybe more will know about what he's doing and see how important it is. So, yeah, hope you enjoyed this. Hope you tune in for more, and thanks for listening.